Hello and welcome to session 10 of Doubting Climate Change, the role of public relations in creating doubt about the science behind climate change. Today we're going to be having a recap, a summary, a resume of what we've looked at and consider what's actually coming next. So to recap, we've seen how successful PR and lobbyist companies are in working for the extractive industries are in presenting their dissenting voices on as balanced discussion in conversations around climate change. And by allowing this to happen, legacy media companies have to accept their complicity in presenting the science as incomplete or overwhelming. So climatologists, these are scientists who've worked their entire career in climate science and looking at things that impact climate weather systems, are portrayed by the media as being one voice in a discussion. The other voice, which is presented by the PR and lobbying companies, and these two industries are very, very intertwined. The other voice is they know very little about the actual science, yet they manage to find ways to undermine the scientist's argument. They do this by creating doubt, as we've seen in various of the other sessions. For example, scientists will never state anything with absolute certainty. They will describe something as having a 95% probability or a 99% probability of happening, but there's always that 0.1 or 0.001% that they won't be certain about, and that's because of the way that statistical probability is calculated. However, when a scientist says 95 or 99% probability, that leaves the door open for industry lobbyists and PR companies and media working against climate science to say, oh, so it's uncertain. There's not 100% certainty around that. So if there's uncertain, it must mean the science isn't that good. So media companies that allow this to happen and allow it to be presented as an equal argument complicit in the undermining of science, because they're not presenting it as this is a 95 or 99% certainty and there is a small chance of a dissenting voice. They present it as an equal argument. This is what we talked about in previous sessions. So again, as we mentioned in previous sessions, having a balanced debate doesn't mean giving equal voice, equal time to both sides or all the different voices in the conversation. And in political debates, it seems fair to give all parties an equal opportunity to present their manifestos and to talk about their key talking points. But when they get into scientific discussions or talking about scientific issues, evidence has to be presented and fact-checked. And what we've seen in recent political debates is becoming a trend where people are not fact-checking the outlandish claims that one party or another party is making around issues where there is a lot of scientific evidence to support one particular perspective. If one side is using science well to inform their position, and another side is bringing nonsense to the table, it's necessary for the media to intervene and to correct these statements or to fact-check them or to call them out on it. And we see time and time again where the media is just standing there basically becoming a press agent for political parties that are in power. And I'm not talking about any particular regime here, this is just what the media do, because their lifeblood, the media industry lifeblood, depends on access. And one of the things that we've seen recently is established media organizations being denied access to political presentations, to political discussions, based on the way that they have been fact-checking in the past, and which is a worrying trend as maybe governments trend towards becoming more authoritarian. So PR companies and lobbyists for extractive industries are very good at grooming spokespeople to speak eloquently in public. Most scientists are uncomfortable with that. They're very good at speaking about the science, they're very good at speaking to scientific audiences, but they're not very good at speaking to the media in terms that non-scientific people will understand. Or understand very easily. So the most articulate person in the room tends to get more than their fair share of time to speak, and moderators tend not to correct them and tend not to pull the conversation back to where it should be. So the case example here is of James Hansen. James Hansen was a scientist working for NASA, and leading up to 1988, he noticed there was climate changes around greenhouse effect on the Earth based on the work he was doing looking at Venus. Excuse me. And his research took him into trying to understand the greenhouse effect and what it was and what it meant on Earth. And it led him to conclusions that the world's climate was changing with potential for devastating effects on humankind and our habitation on the planet. So he was invited to present to a US Senate hearing about his work. And he's very dry, he's very factual, very calm in the way that he presented his evidence. And on the other side, oil companies sought to bring their own experts to debate with Hansen or to debate in the media what Hansen was reporting. And they ran very strong, powerful PR campaigns against him and against his work, and they sought to get his work defunded. They sought to marginalize his work and say that he's basically a crazy guy working in a very narrow field that has no impact on the world. And unfortunately, Hansen was one person working for a scientific entity that didn't have that PR base around him, didn't have that PR base to protect him. And so he was very bruised by the whole experience, and he retreated into his work. He wasn't very good at media conversations talking about his work to an audience who wasn't a scientific audience. And politicized media companies attacked him at the behest of their funders. In other words, the extractive industries, oil and gas companies, big mining companies, wanted to continue what they were doing and didn't want to have regulations restricting what they were doing. And so they sought to shut him up, basically. And they were quite effective in doing that. And that ties into this whole playbook that was put together by the tobacco industry, which we referenced in some of the earlier sessions. And another case, just to put here, is RFK Jr. This is a very current case. And what I put this one in here, it's nothing to do with climate change, but what it's to do with how doubt is created. And RFK is, how can I put this? He's not quite an anti-vaxxer, but he's a vaccine skeptic, particularly around certain vaccines. And one of the key things that he talks about is the use of thimerosal in vaccines, which is a preservative, which hasn't actually been used in vaccines since 2001. But for whatever reason, he continues talking about that as if it's currently in vaccines. And one of the talking points that he has is that he talks about a paper that he read, a scientific paper that he read, where he claims that a CDC researcher conducted a study where they fed sandwiches that had tuna in them, and tuna is a fish that quite often has high mercury levels in it. And they fed these sandwiches to children, and then they checked the mercury levels or the concentration of mercury in their bloodstream, et cetera, et cetera. So what I've put on the screen behind me is a copy of the abstract for the paper that was actually published in 2003. And you can see from there that the methodology involved taking blood samples and samples from stools and urine. There was no part of the methodology where anybody fed tuna sandwiches to anybody. They were talking about infants who weren't eating solid food, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing that RFK is talking about is complete nonsense. It's very easy to find out that it's complete nonsense just by doing a little bit of research, going and reading the paper, which is quite widely available, and seeing for oneself that the guy is talking nonsense. And this is exactly the same kind of tactic that oil companies do around climate change and the impact of humans on climate change. So it's very easy to go and call these people out, and yet the media don't do that. Whenever RFK is interviewed, nobody takes him back to his statement and to the paper and says, this is the fact, this is what the paper actually says. They just ignore it and move on and report on what he's talking about currently. So this is what happens, and the expression that has been coined is called flooding the field. So what you do is you put so much media output into the media sphere that it's very difficult for media organizations to actually pin people down on exactly what it is that's going on. And so things like this happen, and media organizations then, by not challenging, they become complicit in the process. So we also talk a little bit about media consolidation. A picture here of a favorite media mogul, Murdoch, and some of his titles. And one of the things that is a direct consequence of media consolidation, which we see around the world, it's not just a North American or a Western thing, it's something that's happening around the world. Through media consolidation, what happens is you get less independent voice. So if you go back 50 or 100 years, you'll see that in the media, each newspaper, each radio station, each TV station had its own independent editorial voice. And what's happened through consolidation is that the editorial voices, these independent voices, have become less and less and less. And they've also become neutered, because if you're working for a large media organization like News Corp, and you have one editorial voice in essence, which is that of Rupert Murdoch, then if you're dissenting to that in the choices that you make in which stories to cover and the editorial angle that you'll take on those stories, then you're going to be out of a job. So for personal security, people are not challenging these things. So media consolidation has brought about a lack of independent editorial voice that has significant and serious consequences for the way the media works. And then we look at traditional media and politics, and we see how traditional media organizations have relied on access to political discussions, to press briefings, to people who are the legislators, to the people making decisions in our society. And they've relied very heavily on that notion of access. And as the consolidation of media have happened, there are less and less voices, so there's less challenge to these kind of things. And also, people are moving away from consuming traditional media. So now the notion of traditional media is dying as they're trying to maintain their user base, if you will, but still maintain their foothold in discussions. So we look now at new media and politics, and I put here a photograph of that was taken at the inauguration of Donald Trump in January. And you'll see you've got Elon Musk, you've got Jeff Bezos, you've got Mark Zuckerberg, you've got the guy who's the CEO of Google, you've got a lot of tech people. And they're standing in front of the people who would end up being in Trump's cabinet. So it shows that the prominence that these people have, these tech organizations have, and these new media organizations have in relation to the administration. And you see this not just in America, this is happening in other countries as well. So there's been a real shift away from traditional media because they haven't done a very good job, one thing, and they've become very partisan in another way. So there's the reporting on the left and the right is not very discursive. It's very supportive of their political position, and it's not embracing a possibility or a dialogue with the other side. And new media has become even more divisive in that. And new media is becoming embraced by tech giants, but also by politicians, because they can speak directly to an audience without going through any editorial filters at all. And so it's really interesting to see the shift, the pivot from old media to new media. And now, for example, in White House briefings, traditional media are not even being allowed into some of them, and they're encouraging people who run personal blog sites to apply to get access to the President of the United States or Secretary of State or Secretary for Defense in these media briefings. And then the people who are running these new media sites and also the tech platforms are not going to be editorial in what in the way that they present. So they're not looking to present a balanced picture. And if you understand how algorithms work, algorithms reward people who get clicks. The way you get clicks is by being sensationalist on one side or the other of any debate. And so this notion of a balanced discussion is fast disappearing from our media landscape. So what do we do looking forward? So I just put here, this is Donald Trump, and in his campaign he was very supportive of the extractive industries. So he extolled this notion of beautiful, clean coal, as though it's not polluting anything. And as we know, Trump is a climate change denier. And he sees it as a way of the left controlling a discussion and promoting basically a communist agenda, which is far from the truth. And so talking about the extractive industries, and here you see signing executive orders that are privileging the extractive industries with no thought or care of what's happening in the to the planet and the environment. So part of his electoral campaign was drill, baby, drill. So the Trump administration is stripping away support for scientific research in the US and overseas that contains the word if it talks about climate or climate change. So they're going into funding applications and funding approvals that talk to anything about climate, and they're removing that funding. They're trying to cut it out of the discourse of government. So we also see this blitzkrieg upon the environment and regulations and clean energy development. So the policy is being very well enacted. And when you look at the media landscape and the way that this is being reported, it's not being reported as anything other than a byline on what would traditionally be page 3 of a newspaper, this kind of thing. It's not making headlines because there are so many other things, go back to this notion of flooding the field. There are so many other things that are occupying headlines, that things that are significant to the future of the planet and the future of Western and other societies is marginalized. It's not given any real coverage on any media outlets, whether they're traditional media or new media. So Trump said that the climate crisis is a giant hoax, already mentioned. He's taking all of these mentions of climate out of government websites in terms of the funding that's going to universities, the funding that's going to not-for-profit organizations, etc. So there's a widespread funding freeze for federally backed scientific work has already been imposed, throwing the US scientific community into some kind of chaos. And again, none of this is being reported pretty much anywhere. You have to dig really deeply to find out exactly what's going on. And by the way, all of this was presented in the document called Project 2025 that was put forward by right-wing think tanks in 2023 and 2024. And media companies didn't really do what they should have done in terms of looking at what the impact of those the policies that were being put forward in that document were. And so again, this is saying that the traditional media companies did not do a very good job and are not doing a very good job in challenging these things. And the PR companies that are supportive of the extractive industries are doing a much better job. So where does that leave us? Leaves us in a very interesting place. So you see that putting here on the slide, the US government is moving in the direction of Florida, where Republicans barred the mention of climate change in any state laws. So it's becoming illegal to talk about climate change at a state level, and that'll be coming into the federal politics probably fairly soon. This is taken from a newspaper in the last week. And this is just talking about student journalists, but student journalists is the people who are being trained to be the next generation of journalists using whatever media that they choose and the outlets that they can find or create. So US student journalists are going dark, fearing the Trump crusade against pro-Palestinian speech. And this is tied into the Trump administration around DEI and how they're trying to push back against all of that to cancel any funding for DEI. And it's linked to climate change. It's linked to a lot of other areas around scientific debate, around media debates. Because what the authoritarian administrations are doing around the world is trying to bully and scare journalists into not reporting on the things that they don't want them to report on. So here, the article was talking about student journalists are not going to report on, and they're not covering anything to do with pro-Palestinian speech, the discussion of Gaza, the discussion of Israel at the moment. And one can imagine in the very short or near future that the same thing will happen around climate change. As climate change is being taken out of or the notion of climate change is being taken out of the US legislative agenda, then people are going to be scared about reporting on it. And the consequences of that could be quite profound. This is talking about student journalists, this is next generation of journalists, but they're being cowered into not reporting on things that they think people should be talking about because of the way the legislation, because of the way the administration is dealing with these things. So another story here is Trump issues an executive order to block state climate crisis policies hours after issuing orders to increase coal production. And I know that I'm focusing here on the US administration, but what happens in the US tends to have a big influence around the world. And we see this rise of authoritarian governments around the Western world, particularly because that's the one we seem to take most notice of in our media. But it's happening in other parts of the world as well. And we should keep an eye on all of these changes in governance around the world and administration around the world, because it impacts everything that we do. And we can try to do something in terms of having United Nations climate accords and this kind of thing. But if large countries, important countries like the US and China don't subscribe to them, then they're fairly meaningless in what they're doing. And what we see as a result of what's happening in the States at the moment is a lot of European countries have now pushed back on the sale of gas cars, for example. They were supposed to be in Europe, they were supposed to be phased out by 2030, and now most European governments are pushing that back to 2050 because they recognize with what's happening in the States, it's going to be impossible to achieve that. And so this pushing back by 20 years on banning the sale of gas-powered cars in Europe is huge in terms of the amount of climate damage that's happening because of those extra years of gas pollution. And again, that's not being reported on much in the media because there are other things of importance to focus on, potentially. And then we talk about big tech, which largely big tech is the owners of new media companies. New media companies are developing AI algorithms and all of this. So artificial intelligence, large language learning models require a lot of data processing. Data processing takes up a huge amount of energy in terms of just the processing that it requires. The energy is largely gathered by solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not using a lot of energy generation in parts of the world. In America, they're specifically building new coal-fired power stations to power these data centers. But also they need a lot of water to cool the processors down. It's a very water-hungry industry. Again, there's not a lot of media coverage around these things. And we're led to believe that that technology is one of the saviors of our society and help us in climate change. But in actual fact, our increasing reliance on technology is driving climate change at a big rate. And you're not seeing that talked about in the media. You're seeing the PR companies that are promoting solar industry, they're promoting tech industries, talking about the positives of it. But there's big negatives as well, because if you're taking clean water out of the ground and using it to cool data centers and data processing plants, then that water is not being used for other things like growing crops or just allowing people to drink clean, healthy water. So again, you've got an example here of how major news stories that should be being covered by the media are not, and how PR companies working for these extractive industries and these technological industries are presenting arguments against, and they're clouding out the conversation. They're shutting down the conversation before it's even started through their complicity in not giving accurate scientific information to a wider population. So when we come to the future, what can we do about it? Well, at university, we study these things. We talk about ways in which people can become better informed, et cetera, et cetera. But what you're seeing in the States is how scientific conversations are being shut down because funding's being removed. And what you're seeing is happening in the US about anti-Semitic and Gaza and all of this kind of thing as the lever to shut down funding. You're going to see it around climate change in the future, et cetera, as any regulation on industries that are damaging the climate are going to be pushed back. So what can we do? We can become better informed. We can read more. We can actually ask questions. We can support good scientific research and make sure that our voice in a democratic society is one that supports funding of academic research, of scientific research. Ourselves, we can read scientific evidence. A lot of it's available. It's not all behind paywalls, but we can become better informed through that. We can also support better and more independent journalism. We can support local journalism. We don't have to just buy our news from large organizations that are controlled by mega corporations. We can push back against ignorance and opinion. We can support democratic processes. And ultimately, the future's in our hands. If we believe in the notion of democracy, we need to use the media in a way that is not complacent, in a way that isn't just easy for us. We have to actively get involved in supporting good journalism, good scientific research, and hopefully having informed debates that are based on evidence rather than debates that are informed by opinion, because opinion versus evidence is not an equal playing field. And as we've seen throughout this session, the role of public relations companies, they tend to get used by extractive industries that have money to create doubt in scientific evidence. And because people don't necessarily understand the basis of good scientific evidence, then these arguments are presented as equal, and then people form opinions around them rather than actually having evidence-based opinions or evidence-based facts that are informing their discussion. So that's basically what I had to say. So I hope there's been something of interest for you in these sessions. St. Paul University is a wonderful place to come and learn. We have a wide range of courses and programs that touch upon a lot of these issues from a particular disciplinary perspective. So not just in terms of communication, but in terms of social innovation, in terms of conflict resolution, in terms of leadership, etc., etc. So if anything in this series of online sessions has sparked an interest, do come and look at the website, and hopefully we'll see you in our corridors at one time as a student. Thank you very much.